This is a presentation by Pat Donahue in Education 512 at Arcadia University about differentiated instruction. I hope you enjoy. So first, I'm just going to take you on a brief outline of what we're going to be talking about today. So first, we're going to talk about the theories and ideas that are behind differentiated instruction. I'm going to mention a couple scholarly articles that kind of just highlight some of the important aspects I wanted to touch on. And then we're going to talk about the three different types of differentiation that exist and that occur in the classroom, kind of break them down, define them, and give some examples. And then we'll break down how we can modify, general education curriculum for multiple learners and needs, and what are the steps we need to take to make sure that the modification is happening and that we're able to assess how the modification goes. And then we're going to look at universal design and give some real life examples that can be used in the classroom to affect all learners. And then lastly, we're going to touch on the importance of monitoring behavior and embedding social skills within that lesson. So it's not an afterthought, but it's just as important as the content that we're learning and how we're learning it. And then the reference page will be at the end. So first, I just wanted to start with a quote from Tomlinson. Differentiating instruction means shaking up what goes on in the classroom so that students have multiple options for taking in information, making sense of ideas, and expressing what they learn. To me, this quote really hit home and kind of outlines how I think about differentiation, because through all the readings and just kind of from what we understand about education over the last 30 years, I think if you were to ask people around the ages of 30 to 40 and older than that how their experience in education was, they would have a very similar idea. It would be very similar in the way they talked about how they learned, what the teachers expected of them, and so on and so forth. To me, that way is that the teacher had a way, and you better figure out that way if you wanted to succeed in that classroom. And now the way might have differed a little bit from class to class, but I don't think within that same classroom techniques and things were being differentiated. So the term shaking up to me means not just shaking up that current lesson plan on that day, but shaking up the education model as a whole. And I think that's what differentiation has done. I think it reshapes totally how we look at education and how we can look at the classroom. I think it affects all different types of education just by having like this picture on the bottom right. That's a highway. To me, the old form of education would have been one road leading to a path. And as we've talked about, imagine that city is the main goal of the lesson, and all those different roads lead to that path. I think that's what differentiation represents, and I think it's super important. And I think it's also extremely important to understand that it's not a separate assignment or separate path for each learner. It's offering a varied path, 3, 4, 5, whatever the number is, and not one for each, knowing what each learner needs and one path for that, but just offering a variety of options. Because I think teachers get scared when they hear differentiation and they go, oh no, that's a lot more work. I have to have a lesson plan for each kid. That's not what it is. So I just wanted to point that out on this slide. To me, differentiation is three things. It's being proactive, it's being student-centered, and it's rooted in assessment. And this is also from Tomlinson. And when I talk about proactive, I mean just understanding that when the lesson starts, you can't assume that students have the same needs. You need to assume completely different needs throughout the whole entire lesson. If you assume that, you can be prepared for anything. So being proactive in that assumption and not waiting for it to happen and then having to react, but being prepared for that different form of learning. And then student-centered. What that means is when it's about the learner. This picture on the right, I think, really demonstrates that. Imagine a book without anyone to read it. What do those words in that book mean? Nothing. But when you take the learner or the student or anyone reading that book, they are able to take those words and now they mean something. So it needs to be focused on the student and not the content. The content's important, but without the student, it means nothing. So to me, that's what student-centered means and why it's so important. And then also rooted in assessment. And obviously that doesn't mean, the test at the end of the unit, but just throughout lesson plans, throughout units, throughout days, weeks, just always assessing. Assessing where your students are on a constant basis is what allows you to evaluate what you're doing, but also to evaluate their progress and create different paths depending on that progress. So just always be assessing where students are. What are they struggling with? What are they succeeding with? What can I do more of, less of? and just reflecting on all those forms of assessment. In conclusion, I think this quote perfectly sums up what we were talking about, what Tomlinson talked about, in her book, and also just kind of the points I was touching on. In a differentiated classroom, the teacher proactively plans and carries out varied approaches to content, process, and product in anticipation of and response to student differences in readiness, interests, and learning needs. To me, the most important parts of that quote are proactively planning. That way you can anticipate the response to having to change. It's not just saying, well, I'm going to have to change throughout the lesson, so there's no point in planning. Proactively planning for those changes so those different pathways can open up. And I think that's really the motto of differentiated instruction. If you proactively plan, you will be prepared for any sort of change or reassessment that you need. Next, I just wanted to mention 3 scholarly journals that kind of go along with what I was just talking about. The first one's by Anderson in an article that's called Tips for Teachers. And the phrase I want to really focus in on there is how the learners come to understand, because that's what this is all about. It's not about the lesson plan you write before or the tests you have at the end or the student's grade at the end. It's that moment throughout the lesson, throughout the class, that the students are engaging with either the material or each other. And it's how are they getting to that moment? Are there different paths to get to that moment? Because if there are, then you're differentiating. The second one is just an article I wanted to touch on because it's from 1993. And I wanted to mention this because in 1993, they're already talking about the progression of differentiation and how it's advanced so far from where it was. And what they're talking about here is it's for all students. They want to get away from it just being a labeling system for maybe students with disabilities or students who struggle. And I think that's the importance of differentiation. It's not, oh, we need to make it easier for certain students. It's no. Let's not assume what we'll need. Let's just make it have so many different pathways that we're covered. So I thought that was important to highlight. And then the last one is it's an article that talks about 3 different teacher experiences. And this is kind of what I talked about earlier about how teachers must get over that initial hurdle that it's too much work. It's not an individual lesson plan. It's just creating those different pathways, which I've talked about already a couple times. But I just thought it was important to point out in this article. So here we're talking about the 3 different types of ways that we can differentiate in the classroom, and the first one's with content. It's important to understand it's always based on readiness, learning profile, and student interest. And what differentiating content is all about, it's talking about differentiating the methods that get to that content. So for example, if we're reading a book as a class, not just saying, hey, let's do popcorn reading for the whole chapter that you're reading that day, but maybe for the first half of the chapter you do popcorn reading, and then for the second half you allow an option for students to read on their own. So the method of how you read is changed and is varied for everyone, so maybe they feel better reading alone, or maybe they feel better reading popcorn style, and you're just giving them that option. The second one is differentiating process, and again, it's important to understand that it's always based on readiness, learning profile, and student interest. And what this is about is differentiating how the students engage, right? So before it was the method, right? So reading alone versus reading as a group. Now it's about like an interest center that would be varied amounts of time to complete. So the student can go to what they feel most interested in terms of how they want to accomplish that task. So the way they're engaging with that content varies. And that's where you differentiate there with the process. And then the last one is differentiating product. And again, just like I said for the first 2, it's always based on readiness, learning profile, and student interest. And what this is doing is it's allowing students to show what they know in varied ways. So whatever the product, from the method they did it, to the process they accomplished it, the product they produce, you're allowing varied ways for them to accomplish that. So a simple way we could have, if we have a test, instead of saying, give me 5 sentences on this, you could say, draw pictures to represent this, or write 5 sentences, or just allowing them to come up and oral way in the hallway of expressing their answers. Provides 3 different ways just right there of producing the same answer. So next we're going to talk about how to modify the general education curriculum. Kind of the 4 ideas that stuck out to me the most and to me could be the most impactful is starting small. So just because maybe you want your supervisor, or maybe you just read a nice article about differentiation, it wouldn't be the best to just jump, all hands on deck. It would be to start small. Maybe you're just starting with 2 different ways to participate in a group activity or whatever, and build your way up, assessing how you're doing it. And it's also just being able to adapt to quick learners. So you can have a great lesson plan and you have 4 or 5 different ways for them to accomplish the main goal of the lesson, but then someone zips by it like this in the quickest path possible. Always being ready with a second or third activity where maybe they're even just giving back the same content, but it's in a different way. So for example, they accomplished everything so quick. It was just a little scavenger hunt going around the class of clues or whatever, but they accomplished it so quick. Having a sheet that basically just has them take what they did in all the different ways on one sheet and having them fill that back in, just so there's something for them to do, so they feel challenged and not just sitting there waiting for everybody else. And then also that's something that's extremely important is setting attainable but challenging goals. And I think right here is the crux of differentiation. Not having one goal for everybody, but having different goals that challenge each person to whatever reading level and learning level they're at. That way they feel, if they're highly skilled, they feel challenged, right? Or maybe if they're struggling in an area, they don't feel pressured to accomplish that. And then also have timing mapped out but ready to adjust. And that's what we've been talking about this whole time is, proactively planning. And that's that timing mapped out. But understanding, hey, maybe every student, maybe some students, maybe only one student's going to need more time. Allowing that to happen and not, creating disruption in the flow of the class. Right here is the multiple intelligence chart, and it's just the different ways students can learn. And to me, what's can happen on the first day, you have linguistic, logical, mathematical, visual, spatial, musical, right? Bodily kinesthetics, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalistic, existential, right? There's all these different ways to learn. The most important, and this would be a great way to start small with differentiated learning, would be a student survey. And you wouldn't lay out these exact ways, right? But you would have something that, where they could describe, I like to do essay tests, and he's a linguistic learner. Or maybe it's, I'm really good at math, and it's logical mathematics, or whatever it is, just finding out more about your student. So now, as you're planning lessons down the line, you can, maybe there's 6 that you can say, hey, these guys, they love music, right? So creating a way for those musical learners to engage with the content in a musical way. And I think the easiest way to do this is by student surveys and just honestly, just always evaluating. If you're, like we talked about before, if you're always evaluating and always getting to know your student, you're able to combine those two and you'll be able to, touch all these different kinds of learning. So the kind of step-by-step process that, to get this kicked off would be to understand what's the main goal of the lesson. If you have multiple different goals or different levels of goals and all this kind of stuff, it's extremely hard to modify your lesson. If you have a very specific, attainable main goal, now you can get the process of modifying it for all types of learners. The next thing you need to understand is the level of the student or students combined with what skills they have. What do those 2 things change with the main goal of the lesson? After you understand the student and you understand the overall main goal of the lesson, now how can we change the lesson to help that student attain that exact main goal, depending on their skills and learning level? And then once we do this, how can we accomplish the 2 things above while also keeping in mind the social aspect? So not just having that on the wayside or at the bottom of your lesson, but integrating it within the lesson via group work, right? Or maybe it's having a presentation with 2 people where they have to divide responsibilities or whatever it is, where it's not just, how do they work with others? It's a very specific social goal that it's very easy to assess throughout the lesson. The steps of adaptation, first you got to gather information. Then you got to put together potential adaptations. So after you gather the information from the student and about the lesson, now let's make a list of potential adaptations that would, help you accomplish this goal. Once you have a potential adaptations, you can put together a plan that includes, right? So as you're putting together the plan and you have a list of 10 adaptations, maybe you can only use 6 of them, or 4 of them, or 2 of them, or whatever it is. But you have a bunch of potential adaptations that you can draw from, not just trying to fit an adaptation into the lesson. Then you implement it. The only way you're going to find out if it works is by actually doing it within the lesson. And then always, like we've been talking about, being able to adapt. Well, you got to have some backup adaptations in case the initial one doesn't work, or maybe we have a quick learner, or whatever it could be. And then to me, the most important part of it, it's evaluating and it's reassessing what worked and what did not. Because you're going to have multiple cracks at this, multiple years, multiple groups, right? So as long as you're able to realize what maybe you did, what you did wrong, what you did right, and it'll never be that simple as right and wrong, but what you did well, maybe what you could have got better at. Ooh, what were some student questions they had, some student feedback. As long as you're just able to understand that it's a process, you'll always be able to improve. Next, we're going to talk about universal design lessons. And the most important part of this is about meeting the needs of all students. And just like the article I talked about before, where education has progressed and where differentiated instruction has progressed is not just labeling struggling students with ways to accomplish the lesson plan and main goal, but all students. So that's those with learning needs, those who need to be challenged academically, and also those with social needs. And it's encompassing all of that. That way we're able to further the classroom and not just start labeling students who might need help. Some examples of this, UDLs that can be provided in real life examples would be flexible workspaces. And to me, this is my favorite and obviously you won't be able to use this, all day, every day, but finding times throughout the day that allows students to feel comfortable to go to what activity might interest them. And you give them something they need to accomplish, but provide them multiple different areas they can accomplish it multiple different ways, and it's free flowing. They can move throughout the classroom. One, it's extremely relatable to real life, which is super important. And two, it just creates a great classroom environment, right? It's not sitting in a desk. It's not just, lecture. Students are able to move around, work with, collaborate, all that kind of stuff, and always just changing according to your students' needs. Another one that might seem a little simple, but multiple options for reading. So whether you're maybe you're showing a video in class, I think you should always provide a transcript. Or the other way around, if you provide a reading, trying to find an audio link. Maybe it's even a teacher, or you have some students voice over the reading and just provide that as an option, back and forth. That way it's not always just one way, but students have multiple options. And then the 3-2-1. So you provide 3 facts of that lesson. You provide 2 questions that they can take home and think about. And then what's the one thing they learn? I think that's something extremely important in classrooms, and it goes back to having that main goal of the lesson. What's the one thing when students leave your doors you want them to understand? And if you can accomplish that each day, whatever you're doing before that to get there means you're on the right track. And then the last piece we're going to talk about here is monitoring behavior and embedding social skills within the classroom. So I think sometimes social skills, and we've read about it during this summer session, is you can put kind of not on the back burner, but just as a separate thing in education, where I think it has to be an equal part of education, because we need to create social learners throughout. If they just know the content and don't have social skills, right, are we really doing our jobs in the classroom? So the proper social skills can help a student set proper goals and create a positive relationship with school, right? So if you're modeling the proper social skills and the student sees you doing that, they know they should be acting and how they can build their social skills. Well, now when they're in school, it's positive. It's not them just getting yelled at or them feeling negative responses to what they're doing, but creating this positive environment relates school to a positive relationship. I think that's step 1. And then it's also evaluating social skills with the same time and energy as the content, right? So it's not, oh, well, maybe you rate your social skills on a scale of 1 to 4 and your grades in A, B, C, D, and just going 3, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, 4. You can grade that way, but it's putting the same time and effort into building that. Not just having end of semester social skills, but having weekly or day to day or whatever you need, but just understanding it's just as important. If a teacher has that understanding, I think you're on the right track. So how to teach these social skills, I kind of was just talking about some of the 4 examples that, I think make a lot of sense. Model behavior, I kind of just touched on that, but you need to represent that behavior you're talking about, right? Whether that's respect, right? Whether that's honesty, whatever it could be, you need to have that model behavior for the student to have it. If you respect your student, they're going to respect you. If you show honesty and show how important honesty is, they're going to be honest. You're going to give them a roadmap on how to act, not just telling them how they need to act. You need to show them. I think varied group work is super important, right? So not just having every time you do group work being 4 people and maybe they work with the same people, but changing the way you do it. Some days it's one-on-one with another person. Some days it's groups of 4. Some days it's half the class. And it's always with different people. So they're getting to know different people and they're getting to know how to act with certain people. Just always, varying it. I think that's super important. Having a role model workshop, whether depending on the grade you're in, but let's say it's 4th grade, having the 8th graders come down, have them talk about some things they've learned since they've been in 4th grade. So that way, if you have a 4th grader who's in school and they're like, I always get in trouble, maybe an 8th grader comes down into the classroom, gives an example of that spikes a light bulb into the 4th grader that, hey, just because I might not be making great choices now, I can make great choices in school as we go and not just feel like it's a road to nowhere. And then just group share. I think figuring out a way, and it's always going to be different classroom to classroom, but figuring out a way that students and teachers can share what they're feeling, where they feel like they're in an environment where they can share. Maybe they're feeling angry, sad, happy, confused. Figuring out a way that this communication can happen. Maybe it's one-on-one with the student, or maybe a student feels comfortable sharing with everybody, and another student hears that student share and goes, you know what, I'm feeling the same way. And you just create that positive environment. So honestly, overall, I just think it's having a teacher who has an awareness for social skills and how important it is, and not just putting it on the back burner. And this, I kind of just wanted to, how you could collect some data on that behavioral and social skills, and it's whatever the teacher feels comfortable with, but maybe a weekly success chart. I think that positive language is super important. Not having there's some classrooms that have a red light, yellow light, green light, and I think that red light, while it demonstrates when maybe you're not making great choices, if a student's always on the red light, you lose validity in that red light. They're like, oh, I'm always there, right? Having this success chart, they're trying to attain something. They're trying to have positive, relationships and attitude and make positive choices. I think that's a huge part of the behavioral, the collecting that data. You have to make it positive. And there has to be protocol for, negative behavior, but we want to advertise the positive behavior. We want to show the good job, the good job. Well, you're close, but you're not there. And right, you're not going to just make up those successes, but that way we can build and build and build and build and not just tear down a student's, motivation. And right here, just some of my references I joined. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you very much.